Good to talk to you, Sally.
Good to be with you, Alan.
Start by telling me, who is your community? Who do you represent?
I directly represent trans and gender diverse people and bisexual people, which obviously links into the group of communities that is lesbian, gay, bi, trans and intersex, or LGBTI, or happily, as seem to be now done for short, rainbow communities, which is inclusive and I think it's important to cover the whole range of stripes and dots in that rainbow, not just, say, 2 or 3.
And we're talking about issues of ageing, so how visible is that community as they age?
This is a really important point that a lot of LGBTI people have felt like the system's been against them all their life. So it's all very well to say, yes, it's fantastic we got marriage equality on 7 December 2017 in Australia, we're pretty much there. But, if that doesn't just wipe away your memories overnight, if you're someone who's been on the receiving end of electric shock therapy, you've, or conversion therapies, you've had, police stuff. Here we are in the 40th anniversary of Mardi Gras. Remember how that started? We had a society that was against us and police arresting people. And then we also need to honour the variations within the rainbow, that it's still very challenging for trans people at all ages to be themselves. In most states and territories, you can't get birth certificates that reflect who you are unless you have surgery. Only 2 out of our 8 states and territories have that right. Massive rates of mental health difficulties, content warning, 48% of people have attempted suicide, those sorts of things. And then bi people feel very erased a lot and don't feel visible and are often lumped in with lesbian and gay, which distorts research on that, when bi women, for example, and this hits directly at our topic of elder abuse, face worse levels of domestic violence than lesbian and heterosexual women. So there's a whole range of diversity that needs to be considered. So it is really, really important that people are aware of the issues, that LGBTI people are probably less likely to come out in aged care. It's shifting a little in the last, 4 years since training started as a result of the National LGBTI Ageing and Aged Care Strategy. But we're only really, I think, just out of the starting gates. We've got a long distance to travel, although the good news is I think people are warming to the issues and wanting to be more inclusive.
Without wanting to generalise, if you've had a life such as you describe, marked by trauma in your dealings with institutions, whether they be police or government or big institutions, what impact specifically might that have as you get older?
I think we often do an exercise, Transgender Victoria does LGBTI diversity training. We do an exercise early in our training sessions where we ask people to describe a time where they felt like the odd one out. We call it X in a sea of zeros, where you're the odd one out, and ask people to describe the feeling words, and words come up like anxious, depressed, judged. But there's one that hits for me here, and that's mistrustful. You're not going to trust the system. And if you've had stuff from birth, deaths and marriages, or police, or school, you weren't supported, particularly when you were old, for the older generations, and even we'll call it the middle cohort as well, didn't get a lot of support at school, though we're getting a little bit of movement now. You're not going to feel like you're going to be safe. And so that's a really important factor. So it means that, we get people in aged care for service provision saying, if only they told us such and such. Well, we need to understand why. It's a really critical factor in these communities, and as I say, more so for groups like trans and bi. And although I'm not someone who experiences intersex variation of body at birth from expectations, the fact that those unwanted surgeries are still largely happening, my strong guess would be intersex people would feel mistrustful of the system as well. So it's about accepting that paradigm. We can't just change it overnight. I wish we could, but we have to work with that and then say, well, how can we send signals that our service is inclusive of LGBTI people and all groups and all parts of that equally?
Because I can imagine, just listening to you, that if you, just in terms of residential aged care, all sorts of issues would come up. Anyone listening can just imagine what those issues could be. And if there's signalling from the get-go that this will be a different experience, that we're aware of those vulnerabilities, that would make a difference. Are people, you talked about increased levels of vulnerability to abuse throughout life.
Yeah.
How does that manifest itself in ageing? Like, are people in your community more vulnerable, do you think, to abuse?
I think that when you are someone who's from, a range of vulnerable groups, and, sadly, we don't value diversity in our society, and sadly, we often don't value our elders and seniors. So for a start, you're part of the senior cohort, but then you add in other groups. If you are, say, one of the LGBTI, you've got, double whammy, if you like. And then, say, for someone like myself who's bi and trans, it could be triple and so on. And then going beyond my own experience, if you're a sister girl or brother boy, part of the Indigenous LGBTI communities, it could go on. And then add in another factor, which is part of diversity. In diversity, we now seem to have a large amount of evidence, although we don't have perhaps a causation factor, that trans and gender diverse people are more likely to be on the autism spectrum as part of neurodiversity. So that leads to issues of how to communicate information. So there is a lot to consider about making things inclusive. And some of the research that came out 10 years ago honouring those research pioneers like Dr. Catherine Barrett in Victoria and Dr. Joe Harrison in South Australia, which found things like trans people on hormones just had them taken away by staff who put their own judgment on people without reason. Now, we wouldn't take away anyone's heart medication or their stroke medication or whatever it is. Why would we take away someone else's medication when they need it? Hormones for trans women and trans men are vital for our physical and psychological health and well-being. We need them for the rest of their life. Some intersex people may need them as well. So these are the sort of things that were happening, sort of same-sex couples split apart on entry to aged care, and for that matter we've heard of heterosexual couples being separated against their will as well. So people are very, very vulnerable because we have, a power imbalance and misuse of power, as I say, which starts, sadly, often misused against seniors. But then when we add in the misuse of power on LGBTI people, really important. I could go into a particular case study if you'd like on that.
Yes, indeed.
So a really important story, and it's difficult, and I'll give a content warning, but I think it needs to be told. We had the story of an aged care service in Melbourne who had someone admitted by their adult child. The older person was admitted as male. And the staff got a shock the first time they went to bathe the person because the person had a female body. And as the story unfolded, the person said, look, I'm a trans woman, but unfortunately my daughter had never accepted me. And when my partner died, she said, I'll look after you, I'll admit you to aged care, but you've got to go in as a male, under your male name, dress as male, and if you don't do that, you'll never see your grandkids again. So pretty appalling stuff. And, when the staff only found out about this the first time they came to bathe the person when they saw this body. Now, they did the right thing, huge kudos to them. They said, well, we have to act in the interests of our client. And so they said, as much as possible, we'll use your true female name, female pronouns, dress in female clothing or feminine attire, call it what you will. And except for maybe when the daughter came. Interestingly, the daughter never came and neither did the grandchildren. And they were ready to do the right thing and go to the guardianship board, part of the civil administrative appeals tribunal systems. Unfortunately, the client did begin to progress with dementia and was not able to give the case they wanted. So this was a very sort of stuck situation that really couldn't be resolved. It only got to a point of being resolved as best as it could. So this is the sort of thing that people face. But, that's the large one. But then there's things people won't perhaps disclose, and so that can mean for people assigned male at birth, trans women and non-binary people, we still have a bit of prostate left regardless of whether we take hormones or have surgeries. Similarly, most trans men assigned female at birth needing to be male, think Chaz Bono, because often they're less visible, which is an issue in itself. Very few can afford to have the final lower surgery, so we'll still have a cervix and need a pap smear. So these sort of health checks can go awry, don't happen as well because people don't feel safe. So these are the sort of things that can happen, and we need to look at ways a service can be inclusive and communicate that it is, so that we can overcome those sorts of issues.
Those checks, those intimate checks are hard enough to encourage people to have
Yes.
without the additional conversation you have to have of let's talk about whether or not you need that despite how you're presenting to the world.
Well, totally. And then there's other issues, and this happened to one of my close colleagues who's a trans man. Now, this happened at a leading, and it is a very good clinic in terms of inclusive LGBTI services in Melbourne, but to do the pap smear needed a long appointment. And unfortunately, when up at the counter, someone just said, well, what do you need it for? Now, that sort of privacy issue is critical for older LGBTI people. So what does he, he's left in a bind. Does he sort of put on a bit of swag and go, it's a pap smear or something, or does he write it down? Unfortunately, the clinic had some issues with people misusing longer appointments. That's why they asked. So the need for privacy and inclusivity is important, and that could lead to another triggering story, not so much in aged care, but for an older person who is in a public hospital, if we want to do that one as well.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Again, massive content warning. So we had an older trans man who was dealing with generalist health issues, in this case lung cancer, and was in a high intensive care unit. And unfortunately, there's little separation to the bed next to him. Now, the staff were quite good, and he was happy to talk about it, and they needed to bathe him. Unfortunately, the visitors to the person in the next bed overheard and saw the fact that this person's body was different. And this is where we get again to a massive content warning. After the nurse had left, they popped their head over the wall and said, we don't think people like you should be treated in public hospitals. We're coming back with an axe. The patient reported this to the nurse, only to be told, oh, you're just hallucinating, dear, it's your medication. They did come back with an axe, and they got within 3 metres of this person and also his carer, who's another trans man. And if it wasn't for one very petite nurse standing up to 2 very big people and managing to get security on hand, we shudder to think what would have happened. The problem is, because the offenders didn't actually get to the trans people, it's not going to be recorded as a hate crime, and they didn't actually get to them. Sure, they've been charged with having an axe and threatening the nurse, but that's where these things get erased. So this is where we need to make sure privacy and confidentiality are critical, obviously for lots of people, but certainly LGBTI people will feel they need to be safe to disclose things about body identity and expression.
So for you, awareness of this community and some deep thinking about what their needs might be before situations arise is critical to develop any strategy for dealing with ageing.
Absolutely. So what can we do? One of the other things that happens when you're the odd one out is you can become, we use the word hypervigilant, always on the lookout, which can be a negative thing, but when a service is inclusive, our radar will zero in and pick up that a service is inclusive. So yes, there needs to be comprehensive training. Don't just do a couple of things, but things you can do. Change forms so that it's got gender, space and optional, not male, female, circle one. Sure, 90% of the population will just put M or F and won't think, or they'll go, why have you got it that way? You're saving printer ink or something. For us, we'll go, aha, this service has done some training. If there's a chance of prevention, but even if something goes wrong, I know there's someone who will listen if I can complain. Also, having forms that say emergency contact rather than next of kin, which covers more than just husband and wife, separated, divorced, and doesn't just cover partners in the case of LGBTI. It could be Farmer Bob in the country whose best contact is Farmer John, or Ethel whose next door neighbour is Myrtle, or Army Buddy. That's going to be more inclusive. It also helps on the autism spectrum thing, because some autistic people take things literally, and if you say next of kin and they've got no one, they'll just go, no one. But if they say it's emergency contact, and this is my friend who was in the hospital, he'll say, well, that's him over there, and it will communicate. So little things like that, having rainbow lapels or lanyards for staff who have done some training and are feeling comfortable working with LGBTI people, really important. Just sending those little signals, honouring days like May 17th, International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Transphobia, or coming up on March 31st is a particular day. In Trans Day of Visibility, which is a very positive day for us. We call it Trans Awesomeness Day. So having rainbow cake, whatever, some people will just munch the cake, but others will go, oh, they're thinking about us. They might not come out, they mightn't just tell you anything, but the contentment will be there. And we have seen these things work in services that are further down the track, and that can just give people some dignity, and I will finish with a positive story of what happens when we're inclusive and respectful. And this was a service who knew about contacting LGBTI services, and we'd recommend the QLife network, which covers services like Switchboard that have databases. They had an older gay man come out in their service, and they took him to a group in Victoria with the delightful name, the Boilers Society. It's been running for 60 years for gay and bisexual men, and it was just social, but it gets better. He met someone, and the worker who was telling me this story said, "We don't recognise our client anymore. He walks so much taller now," and I'm sitting there going, because it just made a difference. And really, when we ask someone, what can we do for you, we can make life better for all our seniors, including LGBTI.
Wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for your passion and your information and your advocacy. So.
Pleasure, Ellen, and thank you.